Okay, we left off on Tezayin Amud Aleph. 2 dots. We just left off with this. Yisrael of Omi Vrio. The Mishnah says that the Omi Vrio gains her freedom with Simonim. When she reaches puberty, she's released from the service of the master, which is not the case with Eved Ivri. Eved Ivri, it's Shei Shonim. He has to work the 6 years. Yes.
So what if the Simonim occur after 12 and a half years old?
That's separate. Maybe she goes straight into Bagrus. She becomes fully mature. Let's say it's within between 12 and 12 and a half.
But is she always released by 12?
Oh, no. She has to have puberty. We're going to discuss that in a minute. The Gemara is going to discuss this.
But she goes back to the father.
Right. So the Mishnah says, Yisrael of Ami Vrio, she's Yotzis B'Simonim. When she reaches puberty, so let's say the father tells her she's 10 years old. Some girls can reach puberty at the age of 16. But some reach puberty at the age of 12. The Gemara says, what about if she already has pubic hairs before she's 12 years old? Mm-hmm. Before, let's say at 11 and a half, and those pubic hairs don't fall out, and at the age of 12, she still retains those pubic hairs. We'll see, that's considered puberty, because it's within the year before her adulthood. If it comes earlier, we'll see earlier, let's say at the age of 8, she has pubic hairs. It's considered shuma balma. It's like a person has a mole, or a mole has a hair in it, it means nothing. But if it comes at a later date, although she hasn't entered into the age period of adulthood, that hair is valued. So if the hair remains in place, that's considered puberty. We'll see in a moment. Omri shlokish. Omi vria konis atzma b'misa sa'odon. Mirshus sa'odon. B'misa sa'od, mirshus sa'odon. Father sells his daughter into slavery, into servitude. Omi vria. So we have, the Mishnah tells us that she is released with 6 years, she's released with Yovel, and she's released with puberty. What happens when she's in servitude, her father dies? She's also, Rish Lakish is telling, the Mishnah doesn't discuss this. Rish Lakish says she's released from servitude when her father dies. Mises of, how do we know this? Kal v'chomer. As we said, when she reaches adulthood, puberty, she's released from the master, but she reverts back into the domain of the father until she's fully mature, what we call bagrus. Okay? Puberty does not release her from the jurisdiction of the father, but it releases her from the jurisdiction of the master. When the father dies, his rights in her end at that moment. There's no question, when the father dies, she should be released from the jurisdiction of the master. In the Kal v'chomer.
Even though she was designated for a certain time.
Doesn't make a difference.
You give the property to somebody for 6 years and then he dies.
Well, one second. Rish Lakish is basing his understanding on the Kal v'chomer. We find Simonim release the minor girl from the rishus of the master, but not the father, when she becomes an adult. And death releases her from her father. So Rashi explains, normally a father has rights, his sons inherit those rights. So what about, let's say, Masi Yodayim? The earnings of the daughter belong to the father until she becomes a fully mature woman. When he dies, those rights in his daughter, does he pass it on to his children? The answer is no. So what does that mean? That whatever right he has in his daughter, at death, those rights come to an end. Right? So we're saying over here, death, all the rights that he has in the daughter at that moment don't exist any longer. So over here, we see that she's released from the jurisdiction of the father fully when he dies. So you'd say, of course, he's no longer here. No, but we say, normally, the rights of the father are passed on to the son. They're not passed on. So over here, we find, so if Simonim, we see the father's control over the daughter is greater than the master's. Because we see with Simonim that she's released from the master and not from the father. So death, where she's released from the father, definitely she should be released from the master. Before the Kal V'chomer, let's say a more basic. What do I need a Kal V'chomer? This is where we left off on Friday, or every Rosh Hashanah. There's a concept stated in Gemara Bavasar, if I have certain rights, let's say I buy rights in a piece of property and I sell those rights, the purchaser cannot have greater rights than the seller, right? So if the father only has the right, only as long as he's alive, the rights in the daughter, he sold his rights to this master. So the moment he dies, those rights don't exist any longer. The father, if the father dies, the rights come to an end. Torah says you only have these rights only as long as you're alive. That's what Rish Lakish is saying, but he's basing it on the Kal V'chomer. So I mean, what do we need a Kal V'chomer? Say simple. The father sold the master what he has, his rights and his daughter. Those rights, the Torah says you only retain those rights only as long as you're alive. The moment you die, you no longer have those rights. So there's a question, with the master, when he has those rights, is he the father or he has the rights of the father?
Well, we say that also the carriage now goes to the heirs. But if the heir is bound with the transaction...
Of course.
So, why shouldn't that be the case over here? The father had certain rights, he sold his daughter...
Well, but there's a big difference. The sons, you see those rights. What rights are the children inheriting? Right? The rights... that they're inheriting the rights of the father. But the Torah says those rights are only viable rights only as long as the father's alive. The moment he dies, those rights don't exist any longer. Right, I'm explaining why. Because what the sons are the heirs are inheriting are the rights of the father. So those rights are still viable rights even after he dies, because they're passed on. Otherwise, there's nothing to pass on. What is he passing on to the estate?
We see that the ability for a father to sell his daughter is an exception.
Okay.
Because he cannot do that to anybody else.
Because he has no rights. That's the reason.
He cannot sell it to a woman, he cannot sell it to a daughter.
Okay, these rights, it doesn't make a difference. It's like certain things you can sell, you have to be a citizen of a country. You're not a citizen, you're the person, you can't sell it to that person. Same idea.
Given that it's an exception, he can sell his rights to his new master, why should we say that those rights get cut off on the date of the
That's nothing to...
What rights does he have to sell?
I don't understand. Well, just because he is limited, he has rights, but the Torah limits to who he could sell those rights to. That doesn't mean say he doesn't own his daughter. He owns his daughter. So he's selling. But again, what does that have a bearing on the whole discussion over here?
We're saying that the moment the man dies, the will is free.
I know. So Rish Lakish is basing it on the Kal V'chomer.
Has no rights.
Because he purchased. I'm asking, what do we need a Kal V'chomer? He purchased the rights of the father. Those rights are only viable rights only as long as the father's alive. Torah says once he dies, those rights don't exist any longer. So you can't have any greater right than the father himself. Right? So what do I need a Kal V'chomer? It's understood that rights don't exist.
Rabbi, would it be easy to say that the father leases the daughter, so to speak, not selling the daughter to them, by the leasing, he still retains rights to the father. The father still has rights.
What rights does he have today? He may not have. He has no rights any longer. When he gives it over to the master...
But he's not out of... He still has ownership, so to speak, in his daughter.
The master releases her.
What happens if she... What happens...
So then she has...
What? I didn't hear what you said.
The master releases her, she goes back to the father. So he does retain some semblance of rights.
No. It's a question. It reverts back to him. It reverts back. It transfers back.
That's a stronger connection than the Hebrew and the connection.
I'll give you an example. What happens if the master chooses to marry the minor? Chooses to marry her. She's never returning to the father. Correct?
She marries her or no?
No, she doesn't return to him.
Right.
So you see, everything is questionable. So when he releases her, he's actually, now the Torah says, a minor isn't in the possession of the father. It reverts back. If I sell something, I own something today. I own it for now, I own it forever. So if I sell it for 5 years, even now, when you have it 5 years, now I own it for after 5 years. Correct? So let's say he sells his daughter when she's 3 years old. So there's no way she could be, so when she's 9, 6 years are up. She reverts back to the domain of the father. Okay? But it's not so simple. What happens if he marries her? So it's questionable if she's going to revert back. So it's not simple now. He owes her for after 9 years, when she's 9 years old, after 6 years. But owning a piece of property, I definitely own it, even if I sell it for 6 years.
So then why are you saying you don't need to tell the owner? If he has total rights, if the owner has total rights in the girl, then...
But what rights does he have? He has the rights which his father gave him.
Okay,
So if these rights which he takes are only viable as long as the father is alive, the moment he dies, they're not viable. I'm giving you what I have.
so it's a lease. It's a lease.
No, it's not a lease. No, a lease is not determined whether you're alive or not alive. Because that they were heirs tells me that those are viable rights even after you die. Otherwise, there's nothing for the heirs to take over. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm asked, so what do I need a Kal V'chomer? So evidently, you see from Rish Lakish. It's not simple. Because you could see it one of two ways. Do we say when a father, the Torah says a person sells his daughter into slavery as an Omivriya, it's not it's like we spoke about the Machlokas, the Rambam and the Torah, that if a person gives a get to a Shliach, and then the one who had commissioned the agent, he becomes incompetent, becomes a shota, right? So there's a question between the Rambam and the Torah whether if the person on a Torah level gives the get is a valid get. According to Rambam, the Rambam says it's a valid get. According to the Torah, it's not a valid get. So the way they explain what's the argument to Rambam and the Torah, Rambam says when a person appoints an agent, the agent actually assumes is not an extension of the father of the husband. The agent becomes the husband, is the equivalent of the husband. So if he's the equivalent of the husband, it's irrelevant if the husband's incompetent. He's the one. It's like he's divorcing his wife. Regarding get, that's the concept of shliach. Or do you say no? The shliach is an extension of the husband. So if the husband becomes incompetent, the shliach becomes ineffective. That's the argument. So I'm saying we could understand something similar here. When the father sells his daughter, do we say the master becomes the father? It's like the father's still alive. It's true, the rights become ineffective when he's no longer alive. But here the father's alive. Since the father's alive, it's irrelevant that the father died. Or do we say no? When the father sells his daughter, he's selling his rights, not that the master becomes the father. He has the rights of the father. The Torah says the rights of the father when the father's no longer alive are no longer viable. So if they're no longer viable, so if that's the case, she's released immediately.
Do they have to be comparable? One is a sale transaction, the other one is a shaliach.
No, I'm just bringing it as a semblance. Because there, everybody agrees if the husband dies, the get cannot be given any longer.
I'm just saying, it might not, doesn't have to be the same answer. It helps to understand the issue. It doesn't have to be
So I'm saying, so without the Kal V'chomer, I would say, you know something, when the father sells his daughter, it's not the master becomes the father. Doesn't become the father. Right? Or maybe does become the father. So we say, no, he does become the father. How do we see he doesn't become the father? Because I see that the husband, the father, the master, when she reaches puberty, she's released. But if he's the father, why is she released? She shouldn't be released. She should stay there till she's a bogeres, till she's fully mature. So evidently, what do I see from there? That when the father sells his daughter, he's only selling the rights. But I only see that from the Kal V'chomer. If I would not have the Kal V'chomer, I'd say the master is the father. No, 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 no. The father has the rights until she's a full mature woman. Even when she reaches purity, she's an adult. She remains in his domain until she's 12 and a half years old. That's 6 months beyond her adulthood.
But in the case of the acquiring,
She's released
at 12,
at 12. So what does that tell me?
6 months.
So we see when the father sells his daughter, it's not that the master becomes the father, but rather the master assumes the rights of the father. So if the father's rights are said it's still connected to what the father sold him. So if the father dies, the rights are no longer viable. So the moment the father dies, although she's in the domain of the master, that he possesses rights which are no longer viable rights.
You know, there's two practical problems with that resolution. The first is that the owner doesn't know his father.
What does he know? He knows what he's buying.
He does know his father because he could be buying one day's worth of slavery.
It may be. You mean if the father dies?
His father dies.
Doesn't make a difference.
And, well, you know, people might not want to pay a lot for something that's very...
But he knows, but that's the reality. When I buy something unknown, Mr. Glick used to buy from De Beers, right? He didn't know what was in the box.
Someone's going to pay less for it.
No, no.
It's a fact, yeah.
You don't know.
It's clearly a fact.
Person's willing to take a chance.
If I give you a choice...
No, the person wouldn't.
And it's factored into the price.
Right.
If I gave you two products, one is that you guaranteed to have this woman work for you for 6 years. The other one is an unknown amount of time she worked for you. They're exactly the same otherwise. Nobody can pay the same price for those two products. You pay price A for the one that's going to be there for 6 years.
100%.
A minus something.
Okay.
is the one that's
Right.
concerned. The other problem is the same problem you have with the Kohen Gadol, that the daughter's going to hope her father dies, so she can become free.
Kohen Gadol. How do we get Kohen Gadol?
Remember, you have the issue that people in the Mikra, you know, the protection.
Right, as long as he's alive. So the mothers pray that he should die.
Yeah. So here, I mean, the daughter benefits from her father's death. It's just a bizarre circumstance. If the father dies, she goes free. That's what we set up. I'm not sure-
Can I say, let's not discuss this. Factually, if the father dies, the brothers do not inherit the rights of the father. But as long as he's alive, he could sell her. So, so maybe the daughter should pray her father should die, so her brothers can't sell her. Because as long as the father's alive, he can sell her. So she'll celebrate when the father dies. I mean, it's totally irrelevant. It's irrelevant. As long as the father's alive, he has rights. The moment he dies, those rights totally dissipate. They have no relevance any longer. But again, so that's how what we call the chakira. There's two ways to understand it. When a person sells his daughter into slavery, does the master become the father, or does the master have the rights of the father? So we don't know. So we prove from the Kal V'chomer that the master only has the rights, because we see when the daughter reaches puberty, she leaves the domain of the master, and she doesn't leave the domain of the father. So that tells me evidently that it's not, the master is not the father, but rather the master possesses the rights of the father. That's why Rish Lakish cites the Kal V'chomer. Now let's try to understand the Kal V'chomer. You said you had difficulty with the Kal V'chomer. But understanding this way, it's easy to understand the Kal V'chomer. Right? The master, when he purchases the Amivriya, when she reaches puberty, she's released. Which she's not released from the father. But yet, when the father dies, she's released from the father's domain because the father cannot pass on those rights to his children. So we see those viable rights are only viable only as long as he's alive. So therefore, as a result of that, when he dies, the master should no longer be able to retain the maidservant because the rights that he has no longer exist.
Even with that, when the father gets together with the acquiring master, he says to him, here's the deal. I'm selling you my daughter. You will have full rights over her until the earlier of the signs or age 12. The earlier of these two things. If I, he's speaking to him, if I, the master, should pass,
The master means the father.
the father should die during this period of time, okay, it's over.
It's not him. It's not up to him to say. It's not. Maybe it's not over. Who said it's over? You're saying it's over. Maybe it's not over. He cannot dictate. What about a father wants to sell his daughter for 3 years? He can't sell her for 3 years. Torah says it's 6 years or nothing. You want to hire her out, you could hire her out, but to be the Omivriya, where he has rights in her, as if in terms of marrying and all the other rights it has to provide, it's 6 years or nothing. Because the Torah set this in place.
But he says, and by the way, he says to this other man, he says, if you do not exercise your option to marry my daughter, which is the purpose of this transaction in the first place,
Which is the ultimate. That's the best of the worst scenario.
and she gets the son when she's 12,
Or,
okay, if that happens, she comes back to me.
correct? Therefore,
Doesn't matter whatever you
right, okay, good. So therefore what? Therefore what? Has no relevance.
That's the deal.
Whatever the deal is, what the Torah says the deal is. Now we have another question. What about if he dies? Does the father say, and if he dies, she's all, the father of the girl, is she released? We don't know if she's released, right? Because Torah doesn't say that explicitly. The others are explicit in the Torah, right? What about if he dies? So Shlokish is drawing this from the Kal V'chomer. It depends how young.
On the daughter. It's something that happens specifically to the daughter. The second part of the cover, which the father died, is
But
a
again-
relevant condition.
But we had a chakira. There are two ways to understand it. Is the master the father, or is the master, does he have the rights of the father? That's our question. Now, how do you resolve that question? You resolve it with the Kal V'chomer. If he is the father, then she should not be released with simanim from the master. Correct?
How can he be the father if
Because the Torah says,
she takes the shua, right?
what does the shua have to do with this?
Because then the father and the adult have to agree to it or not.
No, there's, oath is something else. No. That's a husband and a father, not a master. Husband. That you have to be a viable, a functioning. He's not a husband. He'd marry her. Once he marries her, he's no longer the master. Nothing. First, she's a minor. Means nothing. She's a minor at this time.
She should take an oath during the time of the slavery.
She's a minor.
A minor. She takes
She has no value. Oath has no value when a minor takes.
in the years of the
Nothing. That's only an adult
after 12.
after 12 years old.
So there's no such thing as
Of nullification of vows and oaths over here at this point.
nothing.
Nothing. And only a father.
No,
It-
but does that right go to the master?
No, of course not. No, doesn't go to the master. Does not.
Because she's not 12. Because only that law only applies after she's 12.
She's 12, after she's 12 years old. That's because it's considered incest. Because there's but again, no, we once explained this, that we rule the halacha, most rishonos konos. The money that the father sold initially, that's what he marries her with. But factually, when he marries her, we don't find the edim, and we don't find, right? There are no edim. So what does it mean? So we explained, when he sells her, he's selling his rights to marry her. Why could the father marry his daughter? Because he's the equivalent of the daughter. But when he sells his daughter to slavery, it's as if now the master becomes the father. The father, if not for the issue of incest, he can marry his own daughter, because she is in his domain. You only need the money to bring her into his domain. But here, she's fully in his domain. She's in his domain without the obstruction of incest. That's the reason why he's able to marry her. One doesn't have to have Adam at the time.
So the Kal V'chomer is showing us that
He's not the father. He has the rights of the father
he has the right, but he's not the father, therefore she is released
when the father dies. That's why Rish Lakish needs the Kal V'chomer. To be continued.